So everybody hates IOA. It kind of deserves it. I feel like it. Yeah, IOA kind of deserves the hate. But anyway, let's go over it. So IOA stands for Inter-Observer Agreement. To get a basic definition for us here, it's essentially like how well two independent observers have their observations or measurements match up with each other. Usually, like when we're looking at IOA, a good score for IOA is 80% plus. But if you're publishing research, you're probably gonna want to aim for 90 plus, because Java they don't publish as much if you only got 80% IOA. So it does kind of get more important when you are doing research. So IOA, what I like to do is to split this up into two separate categories, because these kind of work differently from each other. And if we organize our information a little bit better, then we're going to have an easier time doing it. So the way that I like to separate IOA is that we have IOA for discontinuous measurements, and then we have IOA for continuous measurements. So let's start with our IOA for discontinuous measurements. Just a kind of a recap, when our discontinuous measurements are whole and partial interval recording, and then momentary time sampling as well. So this is how we're taking IOA data for those. We've got our interval by interval. We've got our scored interval. And then we've got our unscored interval. Good. Oh, thanks, Robin. So yeah, let's go ahead and talk about these. Our interval by interval, this is going to be like the most frequently used type of IOA. And what we're basically, so with discontinuous measurements, it's kind of nice that we have some clearer rules about when we should use each type of IOA. So essentially we'll base the type of IOA that we're using off of the amount of responding that occurred in the observation. So there are some kind of clear rules. Our interval by interval is going to be that in the middle. So if if the behavior is occurring for about 30 to 70% of the intervals scored. So remember, like for partial interval or any of these discontinuous measurements, each interval is just being marked as an occurrence or a non-occurrence. There's not like a number in each of those. So that's what we're going to base it off of, is like how or what percentage of these intervals did that behavior occur. So if it's kind of somewhere in the middle, or if you're not even sure like what's going to come up from the data, then you can use interval by interval. It's really straightforward. So essentially an interval by interval, what it does is that we take the small number divided by the large number between the two observations, and then divide them together. So how about we get like a little data set to play with? So two observers here. Again, we're taking discontinuous data. So let's say our data kind of looks like this. And then that's for observer 1, and now we've got observer 2. Let's say the data kind of looks like this. Okay, cool. So what we need to do is we want to look at the amount of intervals at each of that we agreed upon here. So in this one, we had plus and plus, so there was an agreement. The observers reported the same thing. In this one, we had observer 1 had a plus, and then observer 2 had a minus. So this is going to be a disagreement. When we have this one, we've got 2 minuses, so they did agree here. Then they disagreed here, and then they also disagreed here. So to get our IOA, what we want to do is we want to take agreeances divided by total number of intervals. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to take 2 divided by 5, and that will give us 40%. So 40% IOA, not too great. We only agreed on 2 of the intervals of the 5 that we looked at. But again, this is just one session. You can recover from that. It's not the end of the world. So this is your interval by interval. We're taking data on every single interval within the observations. To get those instructions a little bit more clear here too, so we take the number of agrees divided by total number of intervals compared to get our measurement. All right, let's go into scored interval now. So in scored interval, what we're going to do, kind of like a general rule for using scored versus unscored interval, is that it like focuses on what there is less of. And I like to think about it as like what's more interesting in the data. So for scored interval, we're going to use this for low rate behaviors. And we'll define low rate behaviors as about like 30% or fewer of the intervals scored. So again, when we have low rate behaviors, we're going to only focus on those, and there's not that many of them since there's only 30% or fewer of these. So that's going to be more interesting in the data set. So in scored interval, we only focus on intervals where at least one observer scored an occurrence. So let's go back into our table, and then we'll see how this changes. So we only look at the ones where at least one observer scored an occurrence. So we need to omit one of these intervals. Which interval do we need to omit, chat? So we're going to omit interval number 3 here. So in this one, neither observer scored an occurrence, so we're not going to count it here. So in this one, again, we're going to completely omit this interval. Let's see if I can black it out or something. We'll do it a really raunchy way, if I can draw a little better. So in this one, we're only going to focus on the other intervals where at least one observer scored a plus. So now we want to take the agreeances divided by the total number of intervals again. For our scored interval, what we want to do is we want to take the 1 agreeance over 4 total intervals. So on this one, it actually got worse IOA. We got it down to 25%. Let's move this down here for scored interval. So again, we discount that one, that neither observer scored a plus. And then when we look at unscored interval, it's pretty much going to be everything about scored interval, but inversed. So this one we're going to use for high rate behavior. Again, kind of the logic behind that is if we have high rate behavior, fewer of the intervals are not going to be scored. So we're focusing on like what is more interesting or what there is less of in the data. So high rate behavior, this is going to be defined as about like 70% or higher of or more of the intervals are scored. And then this one only focus on intervals where at least one observer scored a non-occurrence. So let's go back to our table now. Instead of omitting session 3, we need to omit the data from a different session. Which one is that when we're taking unscored IOA? Which interval 1 through 5 do we need to omit? Okay, that is correct. Nell and Katie got it. So we are going to omit interval 1 because neither person scored a minus there. Very nice. Good, nice Elaine too. So we'll cross this one out for our unscored interval because it's got 2 pluses in it. We don't want to look at it. And then who can tell me in chat what is our IOA for our unscored interval on this data set? All right, so that is absolutely correct. We've got 25% for our unscored interval as well. So since we're going to cross off interval 1, we have 1 agreeance and 4 total intervals. So we get the same thing as our 25%. So that's our discontinuous IOA. You want to focus on these 3. Again, the really nice thing about this is that there's a very clear rule of when to use each of these. If you don't really know what's going on, that interval by interval can do a totally good job. Okay, let's get into IOA for continuous measurements. So we've got 3 main types of IOA for continuous measurements. Can you guys label those real quick? Anybody want to give it a go? Examples of continuous measurement are like rate, frequency, duration, inter response time, latency. Okay, cool. Yeah, we've got the first one. Elaine and Natalie got it. Total. Sweet. Yeah, Juliana's got one too. So we've got total, we've got mean. So I'm listing out the general categories, and yeah, these can be applied to different continuous measurements too. So we can have total duration, for example, or we could have total count or total rate. Well, yeah, there we go. Juliana's got it. So that is going to be exact. So like exact count, for example. Very cool. So for our continuous IOAs, these are basically like ranked from crudest to strictest. Crude meaning rough. It's like a rough calculation of IOA. Strict means it's like a very I don't know, just strict. A very, yeah, just a strict calculation of IOA. It's a terrible definition. I'm sorry. But essentially, like, what I mean by that is it tends to result in lower scores. So crude tends to result in higher scores. And then stricter measurements tend to result in lower scores. That's really the main thing. Yeah, rigid, that's a decent word. I like that, Kalia. Total, again, is a very rough calculation here. So essentially, like, we add up the total amount of the measurement for each observer. And then we're going to take the small number divided by the large number. So let's get a quick example of that. Let's say like observer 1 reported 12 minutes of tantrum, and then observer 2 reported 13 minutes of tantrum. It's literally going to be this simple. We're just going to take 12 divided by 13, and now we've got our IOA. So yeah, not times 100 twice. There we go. We've got our 92% IOA right there. So very straightforward. And again, like, this doesn't even necessarily have to be like the same instance of tantruming. This could be like a total amount of tantruming throughout the day, and then we just compare those, so it becomes really easy. Cool. Our next one, we have our mean. This one's kind of a pain to calculate, but let's get another data set up here. So here's our mean IOA. So essentially, like, what you want to do is you're gonna the process is that you take total IOA for each interval. And then we average all of the IOAs per interval. Kind of straightforward. Let's look at it. Let's say first one, we've got 10 and then 9, and then we've got 12 and 12. Let's say we've got 5 and 5. Let's say 1 and 1. And then we'll say 2 and 1. Okay, cool. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to take the total IOA for each of these intervals, and then we're going to average all of these together. So our first one, we're going to take 9 divided by 10. We've got our 90% IOA, 12 by 12. That one matches perfect. We've got 5 by 5. So that's going to be another 100% IOA. Same thing here, 1 by 1, another 100% IOA. And now we've got 1 divided by 2. This one is going to be 50% IOA. So to get the mean interval here, what we want to do is we want to add up all of these different IOAs that we got. So our first one is 90. Then we got 100. I apologize, I didn't multiply these by 100, but assume they are. So we've got 300s. And then we've got 50. 440. That is way better. So that is going to be divided by our 5 different intervals that we took the averages for. And then we'll get our thing to calculate for us, and we've got 88% IOA. So that would be our mean IOA. It takes a little bit more time. You got to take the averages for each different interval and then just kind of average the averages. So kind of cool. Let's actually copy this data set. We're going to do the same thing for exact. So in exact, again, this is the strictest form of IOA. And then in this one, essentially, if the intervals don't exactly match, it's an all or nothing game. So in this one, we had a few intervals that match, but 2 intervals did not match. Which 2 intervals do I need to score as zeros here, chat? Let's see that. Perfect. You guys are nailing it. So, this is going to be intervals 1 and 5. So instead of doing this like 1 divided by 2, getting the total for the interval, we'll just essentially be like, it's a disagree, which equals 0. So same thing for interval 1 here, disagree equals 0. Now we're going to do the same exact thing. So now we're going to do 0 plus 100 plus 100 plus 100 plus 0. 300 is our total. And then again, we observe 5 total intervals, so we're going to divide by 5. And now we get 60% IOA when we do exact IOA. So we can note that same pattern occurred. So again, total is the crudest, mean is the middle, and then exact is going to be the strictest. So we saw with the same exact data set, there was a difference of 28 IOA percentage points between mean IOA and exact IOA. And that can be that could be way more drastic depending on the data set too. So watch out, watch out. Like I said, for discontinuous measurements, it's really nice because there's clear rules about when to use each form of IOA here. In continuous measurements, there are not as clear rules of when to use this IOA or when to use each IOA procedure. Essentially, like if it's really important that your data line up, you're going to want to use a more strict procedure. One thing I did not or a couple more details to add about exact IOA is that this is not used for any time-based measurements. So for example, this is going to be duration, latency, and IRT. And the reason for this is that it's just really unlikely to get these things to match up really well, so we just don't use it. So the strictest, if you're asked, like, I've seen this question before, it's like, if you're taking duration data, like, what's the strictest form of IOA that you can use? Your answer there is actually your mean IOA, not your exact. So watch out, they might try to trick you like that. Hey there, Nick here. Hope you enjoyed that clip pulled from one of our live study halls that occur on Thursdays at 7 p.m. Eastern. If you attend live, you can win some awesome prizes as well as the notes from each of the sessions and submit your topics. Hope to see you Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern. Laters.